Canada is fighting on two fronts, one against Donald Trump's renewed trade war, and another against its own workers. On the one hand, Ottawa faces an external economic assault, tariffs targeting Canadian energy, autos, and agriculture, threatening to choke off the country's export-driven economy. On the other hand, the federal government is turning inward, invoking Section 107 of the Labor Code to shut down strikes at railways, ports, airlines, and even the postal system. These interventions come just hours into legal job actions, short-circuiting the very collective bargaining processes that Canadian labor law was designed to protect. The paradox is striking. At the same time that Ottawa calls on unions and workers to help Canada withstand the pressure of American tariffs, it is stripping those same workers of their ability to strike, their most powerful bargaining tool. The result is a dual sovereignty crisis, external pressure from Washington that questions Canada's competitiveness, and internal pressure from organized labor that challenges Ottawa's legitimacy in managing its own industrial peace. Together, these two conflicts threaten not just the country's economic stability, but the very coherence of its political strategy in the face of a global trade confrontation. At the heart of this confrontation lies Canada's economic geography, a system built on deep integration with the United States. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports are absorbed by the American market, making the country extraordinarily vulnerable to tariffs aimed at its core industries. Energy, automobiles, and agriculture form the backbone of this relationship. Alberta's oil sands supply crude that feeds U.S. refineries. Ontario's auto plants rely on a steady cross-border exchange of parts and vehicles. Prairie farmers ship grain and livestock south in volumes that sustain entire regional economies. These flows depend on the infrastructure of unionized labor. More than 3 million Canadian workers in transportation, logistics, and manufacturing function as the gatekeepers of this export economy. Their ability to move goods is what keeps supply chains intact. The country's industrial choke points make this dependency visible. CN and CPKC railways, together moving nearly 300 million tons of freight annually, are the circulatory system of the economy, carrying crude oil, grain, coal, and auto parts across provinces and into U.S. markets. The ports of Vancouver and Montreal, handling over $300 billion in goods each year, are the maritime gateways for both Asian imports and North American exports. Even the passenger airlines Air Canada and WebJet are not just about moving travelers. They serve as critical arteries for high-value cargo, such as pharmaceuticals and aerospace components, where timing is as important as volume. It is at these junctions, rail lines, ports, and airports, that both Trump's tariffs and Ottawa's back-to-work laws converge. Tariffs squeeze profitability and volume at the border, while federal interventions against strikes attempt to keep those flows from stopping altogether. Together, they expose the fragility of an economy that relies so heavily on uninterrupted movement across a few critical corridors. Since June 2024, the Canadian federal government has relied heavily on Section 107 of the Labor Code, a provision that grants the Jobs Minister sweeping authority to intervene in labor disputes in order to preserve what it calls industrial peace. In practice, this has meant that some of the most significant strikes in the country's federally regulated sectors have been cut short almost as soon as they began. WestJet mechanics, CN and CPKC railway workers, port employees in Vancouver and Montreal, postal workers at Canada Post, and most recently more than 10,000 Air Canada flight attendants have all seen their strikes effectively suspended within hours of walking off the job. In the case of Air Canada, the government acted in less than 12 hours, ordering attendants back to work and sending the dispute to binding arbitration. The rail strike last summer lasted just 17 hours before it was quashed. None of these disputes were given the time necessary to build the economic pressure that strikes are meant to create. This pattern has created a new dynamic in Canadian industrial relations. Employers now enter contract negotiations with the expectation that Ottawa will intervene if talks break down. In Air Canada's case, management formally asked the government to step in even before flight attendants had begun their strike.
That preemptive request highlights the degree to which Section 107 has altered the balance of power. The strike, once the most powerful tool available to unions to compel genuine bargaining, is increasingly blunted by the government's readiness to suspend it. The result is a bargaining process distorted by political calculation, where employers anticipate federal rescue and unions are left with diminishing leverage. The consequence is not simply a legal dispute over the constitutionality of Section 107, but a structural shift in how Canada manages its critical industries, at precisely the moment when global trade tensions demand resilience rather than fragility. The economic stakes surrounding these strikes are enormous, and they explain why Ottawa has been so quick to intervene. A one-week shutdown of CN and CPKC rail operations could paralyze the movement of goods across the country. Nearly half of prairie grain exports, representing billions in farm revenue, would sit idle, jeopardizing Canada's role as a reliable supplier to global food markets. Auto plants in Ontario and Quebec, which depend on a finely tuned rhythm of cross-border shipments, would face delays on nearly $1 billion worth of parts, forcing assembly lines into costly slowdowns or outright closures. Alberta's oil sector, which relies on rail to move crude when pipelines run at capacity, would be constrained almost immediately, reducing export volumes and depressing provincial royalties. The impact is just as severe at the ports. When the terminals in Montreal and Vancouver grind to a halt, more than $500 million in goods are frozen every single day. Container backlogs ripple across the supply chain, affecting industries as diverse as consumer electronics, mining equipment, and grocery distribution. Because Canada's auto industry is built on just-in-time delivery, even short disruptions cascade into plant shutdowns, layoffs, and contractual penalties. Airlines add yet another layer of vulnerability. A strike by Air Canada's 10,000 flight attendants does not only inconvenience passengers, it also interrupts the transport of high-value cargo such as pharmaceuticals, electronics, and aerospace components. These are sectors where timing is as critical as volume, and even brief delays can lead to multi-million-dollar losses.
It is on these grounds that the federal government defends its interventions, citing the immediate negative impact on Canadians and our economy is justification for sending workers back on the job. Yet that rationale collides with constitutional law. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed that the right to strike is protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as part of the guarantee of freedom of association. By repeatedly invoking Section 107 to terminate strikes almost as soon as they begin, Ottawa is not only curbing workers' economic leverage, but also stepping onto uncertain legal ground. The clash between urgent economic concerns and entrenched constitutional rights lies at the core of this conflict, raising the question of whether Canada can defend both its industrial stability and its democratic labor protections at the same time. Prime Minister Mark Carney entered office promising to defend Canadian jobs and shield the economy from the disruptive force of Donald Trump's tariffs. Yet his government's repeated use of back-to-work powers has placed him on a collision course with the very workers whose support he once courted. During the election campaign, Carney positioned himself as a champion of organized labor, frequently appearing alongside union members and pledging that his administration would treat them as partners in safeguarding the national interest. But within months of taking power, his reliance on Section 107 of the Labor Code to end strikes at airlines, railways, ports, and the Postal Service has left many labor leaders feeling betrayed. One union leader described him bluntly as "not our friend," accusing him of using workers as backdrops for photo opportunities while undermining their rights when negotiations turn difficult. This shift comes at a time when labor activism is surging across Canada. In 2023, the number of days not worked due to strikes soared to 6.6 million, the highest figure recorded since 1986. The resurgence has been fueled by years of stagnant wage growth, soaring living costs, and an affordability crisis that has left many Canadians feeling squeezed. For unions, the right to strike is not only a bargaining tool, but also a constitutional protection affirmed by the Supreme Court a decade ago. When Air Canada flight attendants openly defied Ottawa's back-to-work order, risking heavy fines and even jail time, they signaled a willingness to confront the federal government directly and to set a precedent for other unions facing similar interventions. Their defiance underscored the depth of frustration among workers who believe their rights are being systematically eroded. The strategic irony is difficult to ignore. Ottawa needs a united labor movement to withstand external pressure from Trump's tariffs and to maintain the reliability of Canadian supply chains. Yet by repeatedly quashing strikes, the federal government is fracturing the very coalition it requires.
Instead of solidarity, it faces mounting resistance from unions that no longer trust its intentions. At precisely the moment when Canada's external economic position demands internal cohesion, the government has created a domestic rift that threatens to undermine both its labor policy and its trade strategy.
If strikes continue to be suppressed through rapid federal intervention, the balance of bargaining power will tilt further in favor of employers, creating an environment in which companies have little incentive to negotiate seriously at the table. Instead of moving toward compromise, management can afford to wait, confident that the government will step in to restore operations and neutralize union pressure. This dynamic not only prolongs disputes, but also deepens mistrust, making future rounds of bargaining even more contentious. The legal foundation of these interventions is itself unstable. Because the Supreme Court has recognized the right to strike as a constitutional freedom, Section 107 is vulnerable to being struck down in court. Should that happen, Ottawa would suddenly lose one of its most powerful tools for maintaining industrial peace, leaving the government exposed to uncontained labor disruptions at a moment of heightened external economic stress. In the meantime, the suppression of legal strikes risks provoking a wave of unsanctioned, so-called wildcat actions. These are far harder to police or predict, and when they erupt in strategic sectors like rail transport or port logistics, the economic costs can spiral quickly. The risk multiplies when this internal instability collides with Trump's tariffs. If rail workers or port employees choose to escalate job action during a period of heightened trade tension, the impact on Canada's economy would be amplified. Tariffs already erode competitiveness by raising costs and narrowing margins. Add to that a sudden stoppage in rail capacity, and prairie farmers could face a dual shock: American duties on their canola and beef abroad, coupled with the inability to ship products out of the country at home. A similar chain reaction would hit the auto sector, where just-in-time supply chains mean even minor disruptions halt assembly lines. At the macro level, bond markets respond swiftly to these kinds of risks. Investors who see both trade uncertainty and labor instability will demand higher premiums to hold Canadian debt. This comes at a time when deficits are already weighing on fiscal credibility, compounding the pressure on Ottawa's borrowing costs. The picture is further complicated by the divergence across provinces. In Alberta, the government has pursued higher wage settlements with civil servants, seeking to prevent labor unrest in a province whose energy sector is indispensable to national revenues. By contrast, British Columbia, wrestling with a $10 billion deficit, has resisted similar increases, sparking walkouts by public service workers and escalating picket lines. These provincial contrasts fuel comparisons and resentment, with unions pointing to Alberta's concessions as proof that Ottawa and other provincial governments could afford more if they chose to. The result is a patchwork of industrial relations that fragments national cohesion, weakening Ottawa's ability to present a united front in its economic confrontation with the United States. Instead of projecting stability, Canada risks broadcasting internal division, where the fractures between provinces, between employers and workers, and between government promises and actions all converge into a wider crisis of confidence.
Canada's real vulnerability in this moment is not simply the tariffs being imposed by Donald Trump's administration, but the fracture lines running through its own system of industrial relations. Ottawa is attempting to wage a trade battle abroad while simultaneously constraining the very workers at home who form the backbone of its economic resilience. The contradiction is stark. A government that pleads for solidarity in the face of external pressure is the same government that strips away the right to strike, the most fundamental tool of collective bargaining. In an economy so heavily dependent on the seamless flow of goods across rail lines, through ports, and via airlines, these workers are not peripheral actors. They are the arteries that keep national commerce alive. Disrupt those arteries by eroding trust, curving rights, or provoking defiance, and the system begins to clog from within. Suppressing labor may buy Ottawa short-term continuity, keeping trains running or flights in the air, but over time it risks a deeper rupture. If workers lose faith in institutions and resort to unsanctioned actions, if courts move to curtail the government's powers, or if employers adapt by counting on federal rescue rather than bargaining in good faith, then Canada's internal vulnerabilities may prove far more damaging than any tariff Washington can impose. In that sense, the struggle with Trump is only half the story. The larger test for Canada is whether it can maintain industrial peace without sacrificing the democratic rights of the very people it needs to keep its economy moving.